Okay. Okay, could everybody see?
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me today. Appreciate Eileen for inviting me and Mary and others for making this possible. My name is Peter Drekmeier. I'm the policy director for the Tuolumne River Trust. I've been with the organization for 14 years, so getting to know the river of our drinking water source pretty well. If any of you did not know that the Tuolumne was the source of Hetch Hetchy water, you're not alone. We did a survey of San Francisco voters a couple of years ago, and 75% could identify Hetch Hetchy as their primary water source, but only 12 could identify the Tuolumne River. So part of our job is to let people know there's a river that feeds the reservoir. And this is a map, and it shows Yosemite National Park on the right there. The northern half is drained by the Tuolumne. The southern half is drained by the Merced, which carves out Yosemite Valley. The Tuolumne carved out Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is now a reservoir, and that's in Yosemite. And then as the river flows west, you can see another big reservoir there called Don Pedro. And that is owned and operated by two irrigation districts in the San Joaquin Valley, Modesto and Turlock. And that water is primarily for agriculture. It irrigates about 200,000 acres. And the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has an interesting relationship with that because they pay for almost half of it. And what they got in exchange is something called a water bank, which means they can prepay water. So in big water years or average years, when there's plenty of water to fill the SFPUC reservoirs, they can start banking water in Don Pedro up to 1.5 times what Hetch Hetchy holds. So it's a pretty big water bank. And then at times when their water rights would not let them capture water at Hetch Hetchy, they can, and they subtract an equal amount on paper from Don Pedro. So they don't access that water, but they could use it to meet the senior water rights of the irrigation. And then you see that Tuolumne joins the San Joaquin, flows up into the Delta and the Bay. So that's the journey. And most of the water that we drink from the Tuolumne originates as snow. And as the snow melts, it forms little streams that join each other, get bigger. And the name Tuolumne starts just upstream of Tuolumne Meadows, which some of you are probably familiar with. And from Tuolumne Meadows, the river flows through the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne and into what used to be Hetch Hetchy Valley. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, San Francisco wanted to build a dam to create the reservoir, and John Muir and the Sierra Club fought it, and they convinced Congress to not allow it because national parks are supposed to be for everybody and for wildlife and recreation and enjoyment. But with the big earthquake and fires in 1906, Congress was more sympathetic to San Francisco. And in 1913, Congress passed what's called the Raker Act, named after Congressman John Raker from California. And this granted San Francisco the right to build the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in Yosemite. And the dam is named O'Shaughnessy Dam after Michael O'Shaughnessy, who was the director of public works, who oversaw the project. It was pretty amazing what they did from between 1913 and 1923. They completed the dam and other infrastructure to deliver water to the Bay Area. And the Raker Act established water rights so that the two irrigation districts I mentioned, they were the earliest water rights in California dating back to 1867. So they have senior water rights. And the way that works is the first about 2,400 cubic feet per second. So imagine a basketball being a cubic foot. So the first 2,400 belong to the irrigation districts, and anything above that belongs to San Francisco. So you can see that the green is San Francisco's water, and when you have the spikes there, that was a storm or a lot of snow melt, and the water entering the reservoirs was much higher, and they could collect a lot of that. And then for 2 months between mid-April and mid-June, that goes up to 4,000 cubic feet per second CFS, because that's the time when the snow is melting in the runoff. And I'm not going to talk a lot about climate change today, but if you have questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer them. But one interesting thing is what we're pretty certain is going to happen is runoff's going to come earlier. More precipitation will fall as rain than snow. The snowpack will melt earlier. And that's actually going to benefit San Francisco's water rights, because if you move water runoff from that time period when the irrigation districts get the first 4,000 into the time they get the first 2,400, it moves water from their rights to San Francisco's. San Francisco is working on a climate change vulnerability assessment that's going to be released probably in the next 2 months. So we'll be hearing more about these issues. And with San Francisco, you can see on the far right, not to scale, there's not just Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, but Lake Eleanor and Lake Lloyd, which is more commonly known as Cherry Lake. So they have those 3 reservoirs, but we get our water from Hetch Hetchy. The other ones generate hydropower or help them meet their obligation to provide water to the irrigation districts. And then that water comes all the way to the Bay Area, gravity fed, 160 miles, generates hydropower along the way. And it about 1/3 of it is used by San Francisco and 2/3 by customers in San Mateo County and parts of Alameda and Santa Clara County. And 85% of SFPUC water comes from the Tuolumne, 15% comes from local reservoirs. You see some here, Crystal Springs, Calaveras, and a few others. So those customers outside of San Francisco, they're known as wholesale customers, and they're represented by an organization called BOSCA, which is the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency. There are 26 groups, and basically they're kind of a watchdog over San Francisco, making sure the finances are done right, et cetera, looking out for the interests of those other customers. And in a lot of ways, they partner with the SFPUC. In some ways, there are some differences of opinion. But there are 2 of these BOSCA member agencies, San Jose and Santa Clara, that are known as interruptible customers. And I know Eileen wanted me to touch on this a little bit. So that means they don't have long-term contracts. The others have contracts in perpetuity, that San Francisco shall provide them up to a certain amount of water that they pay for, and they don't have to pay for water that they're not using. But for example, I live in Palo Alto, and our supply assurance is 17 million gallons per day. And that was established at a time when Palo Alto was using a lot more water. We're now down to 10 million gallons per day, and we're probably going to stay there. But what our contract allows is if there's a lot of development or something, we could go up to 17 million gallons per day. So San Jose and Santa Clara, they both are interruptible. They both get 4.5 million gallons per day. So it's a total of 9 million gallons per day. And they've asked for an additional 6.5 million gallons per day. And they've asked to become permanent customers so that they can be guaranteed that they would get water from San Francisco and not get cut off at some point if it's determined there's just not enough water for them. So they were, it was at a time when San Francisco had extra water, and they said, hey, yeah, we'll sell it to you, but we can't guarantee it forever. So this is the watershed, the area that drains into the Tuolumne, and kind of in the middle there, you see the Don Pedro Reservoir. Everything upstream of that is designated a wild and scenic river. And that was our first campaign at Tuolumne River Trust. We were actually founded in 1991 when 3 more dams were proposed for the upper Tuolumne. And in 1984, we convinced Congress to designate it a wild and scenic river, which was a huge victory. And downstream of Don Pedro, well, here's Don Pedro Dam and Reservoir. And Don Pedro holds 6 times as much water as Hetch Hetchy. So it's a very large reservoir. It's the 6th largest in the state. So downstream is another lovely stretch of river. It's very different than the whitewater you'd find in the upper part, but this is where we still have salmon, Chinook salmon. And salmon start their lives in fresh water. When the babies are big enough, they go out to the delta and the bay and the ocean. They live there where there's a lot more food. And then when it's time for them to spawn, they come back to the fresh water, to this same river. And they'll lay about 5,000 eggs and then they'll die. And they've brought all these nutrients from the ocean into these upland habitats. So they're really, really important for the ecosystem. These ones are fall-run Chinook salmon, and they're going to be spawning in early November. And we do some trips called canoeing with the salmon, where we take people out and we float down the river and we hope to see salmon coming up to spawn. It's a really nice opportunity to get to know the Tuolumne and some of the animals there. And so if anyone's interested, we have information on our website about that. So fall-run Chinook salmon are also known as king salmon because they're the largest salmon. Usually they don't grow this big. This one was 108 pounds. But you can see if they bring a lot of nutrients from the ocean to these upland habitats, and they fuel the food web. There are more than 100 species that depend on them. They fertilize soils in the forests, meadows, even farmland. So what I refer to the system as a salmon-based ecosystem. A lot of people say, it's fish versus farms or people versus fish, but it's really an ecosystem that we're trying to protect. And the big challenge is that humans divert 21% of the water they've 79%. So only 21% of what's called unimpaired flow, what would naturally come down the river in an average year, makes it all the way out the Tuolumne. And so people are diverting 4 out of 5 gallons, and that's had a huge impact. And similar to the rest of California in general, 80% of the water that's diverted is used for agriculture. So 200,000 acres, a lot of water, and about 20% of the diversion comes to the Bay Area. And the irrigation districts aren't the most reliable stewards of our natural environment. And in fact, even though there are challenges of, is there enough water to go around, there are a lot of permanent crops that are being grown and put in. So what they're doing is they're converting seasonal crops that can be fallowed in years like this, when there's just not enough water, to permanent crops that they have to water every year. And almonds are the big one now. It takes a gallon of water to produce 1 almond. And you can see during the recent drought, the amount of orchards going in just kept growing. So that's been a huge challenge. And in fact, the Tuolumne River, San Francisco's river, is the worst off of all the rivers in the Central Valley. There's a goal that the state has of doubling the salmon populations in these rivers. Some rivers have done better than others, but you can see on the far right, those are the 3 rivers that drain into the San Joaquin River. So the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and the Merced. And they're worse off than the rivers draining into Sacramento, and the Tuolumne is the worst off of those. Oops. And there's a real correlation between the flows in the river and the success of salmon. So in years when there's higher flows, the baby fish can get out into the Delta Bay Ocean. And then 2.5 years later, when it's time for them to spawn, they come back in and we see higher numbers. So there's definitely a correlation between flows and salmon health. So pretty much everyone acknowledges the San Francisco Bay Delta is in a state of ecological crisis. And there are different ideas about what we need to do. We have ideas based on science, and a lot of the water agencies have ideas based on junk science because they want to say we can produce more fish with less water. But the state water board is now updating the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And so this dictates, flows and other issues related to the Bay Delta. It was required by the Clean Water Act, first adopted in 1978. It was updated in 1995, and more than 25 years have passed, and it has not been updated, and conditions keep getting worse. So this is a really big deal. It's been in process for more than 10 years. These things take a long time, but we're slowly making progress. And the Delta is the largest estuary, the Bay Delta, the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. Very, very important ecosystem. About half the precipitation that falls on California drains out through the Delta. And it supports remarkable biological diversity, more than 500 species of fish and wildlife. And it's a major stopover for the Pacific Flyway. It's the migration corridor for anadromous fish that start their lives in freshwater, go out to the ocean, then return. And historically, more than 1 million salmon pass through the Delta to spawn in California's Central Valley rivers. But things started to change, especially with the gold rush and a lot of people moving to California from other parts of the country and other countries. And so a lot of the Delta land got transformed into agricultural land. So levees were built to keep them from getting flooded. So these natural wetlands that were really important habitat disappeared. And then the diversions upstream of water led to a lot less fresh water flowing into the Delta and the Bay. And that's had a huge impact. And the low flows have a big impact on the rivers. The pollution can concentrate. And really importantly, the rivers can get too warm. And the native fish depend on cold water. They like that snow melt and cooler water other times of the year. So this is a photo from the Klamath River. Under the Bush administration, a lot of water got diverted for farms in Southern Oregon in 2002. And the water got so warm that 70,000 salmon died. So flows are really critical for water temperature. Also, fish need water to get to their spawning grounds and especially to flush out the babies when it's time for them to go to the ocean. And so with low flows, it's a very slow process and there are a lot more opportunities for predator fish. Many of them are non-native that like the warm water, like bass, to eat those baby fish. So mortality has been a really big issue. And naturally, you'd have these floodplains, which provide refuge for the baby fish. It's, the predators are in the main channel. And so if they can get into these floodplains, there's protection from the predators, but there's also a lot more food. So they get bigger, maybe twice as big as they would have. And when it's time for them to outmigrate, they have a much better chance of getting out quickly and not being eaten by a bigger fish. So what's really happened is we've altered the ecosystem. We've changed it from a fast flowing cold river to a slow moving warm stream. And it now favors non-native species that evolved in those conditions, like bass, or in this case, water hyacinth from South America. And so the non-natives are able to outcompete the natives in a lot of situations. And that's been a big, big problem. And then this stagnant water that has lots of nutrients in it during drier years like this year leads to toxic algae blooms in the Delta. And these are, it's a cyanobacteria that creates neurotoxins that can make pets and animals die and make people sick. And so when you hear about toxic algae blooms, that's a result of really low flows. And then it's also changing the salinity balance of the Bay Delta. So in an average year, maybe half of the natural flow makes it to the Bay Delta. This year, it's probably a third. And so salt water intrudes up into the Delta. Sometimes it even gets to the Delta pumps that a lot of water agencies depend on for their water, for agriculture, for drinking. And it impacts everything from plankton at the base of the food web all the way up to the other species. So there are 6 threatened or endangered species of fish in the Delta. And the impact trickles all the way up to orcas in the ocean that depend on salmon. So it's really a food web that's in crisis. And people who depend on salmon for jobs, we still have a commercial fishing fleet in San Francisco, Fisherman's Wharf. It's a lot smaller than it used to be. In 2008 and 2009, they had to cancel the fishing season because there just weren't enough salmon. And this year it was curtailed. So a lot of fishing people are giving up. The situation is too challenging for them. So the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan was broken into phases, and phase 1 focused on the San Joaquin Basin, including the Tuolumne River. And after many years, the State Water Board did a really good thing at the end of 2018, and they adopted higher flows for the rivers. And they adopted 40% of unimpaired flow, so natural flow between February and June, which are critical times for the baby fish. And they were going to focus on phase 2 next, which is the Sacramento Basin. But they were sued by the irrigation districts over phase 1, and San Francisco joined in that lawsuit. So here is this very liberal, environmentally minded city that is opposing measures to restore our namesake Bay and Delta, San Francisco. And they put out a lot of misleading information. So right after the plan came out, they said, oh, this could cost us 188,000 jobs and $49 billion. But what actually happened during the drought is we gained 27% more jobs, but the amount of water used dropped by 23%. So very, very different than their narrative. And since then, they've revised their projections. They're now less than half of what they were saying before, but even that's an exaggeration. And one of the reasons why we're doing well when it comes to water demand is that the price of water has gone up a lot. So people are seeing a price signal, and it makes sense to invest in water efficient appliances, drip irrigation, other things. So we've done a good job with that. And the price of water has actually tripled over the last dozen years, because in 2008, the SFPUC adopted what's called the Water System Improvement Program, or WSIP for short. And this is 80 different projects, capital projects aimed at making sure we could withstand a major earthquake, because the lines cross over 3 earthquake faults. And it was $4.8 billion plus debt service. So someone's got to pay for that, and it's us, the customers. And at the time, back in 2007, 2008, the SFPUC was projecting that the demand for water in the whole service area in the Bay Area would be 285 million gallons per day by 2018. And environmental groups supported the concept of having a reliable water supply, but we opposed San Francisco's bid to divert an additional 25 million gallons of water per day. It's already a very hardworking river, worst off in the Central Valley. You can't take more water. And Ed Harrington, who's now on the commission, was when he became the general manager, his first day, he contacted us and said, hey, look, we have an idea we want to float by you, see if you might agree to it, kind of a compromise. And that was to cap water sales at 265 million gallons per day for 10 years until 2018. And if there was a deficit, they would make it up through conservation, recycled water. And then the idea was in 2018, we'll see where we are, and we might make some changes. And one of those potential changes was to consider making San Jose and Santa Clara permanent customers. But even before the drought started, we were down to 223 million gallons per day. So again, that price signal was telling people, hey, conservation pays off, and people were wiser with their water use. And then during the drought, we got down to 175, 180. And in 2018, demand was not 285, it was 196. So their projections were off by 31%. And because we were so far below the sales cap, they punted on the decisions about whether to change it, on whether to make San Jose and Santa Clara permanent customers. We'll come back in 2028. So those decisions will be made over years. And again, we've done a really good job. Water demand has been going down for decades. You can see for those 2 years, 2016 and 17, we were actually using less water than we were back in 1977 when we had a big drought, really dry year. And that's despite population growth. And we haven't seen a big rebound. It's pretty much plateaued at around 200 million gallons per day. So we're holding it down. But the demand projections have always been inflated. And this is a document from 1993, and it shows they were projecting demand might get up to 400 million gallons per day, 500 million gallons per day. Then I overlaid what I just showed you, and we're at 200. So basically, their demand projections were more than double what the reality was. But because they were planning for so much demand, San Francisco is actually well positioned for droughts in that they have a lot of storage. So you can see here, it's almost 1.5 million acre feet, an acre foot. Imagine a football field, foot deep with water. And demand currently is about 225,000 acre feet per year. So when all their reservoirs are full, there's enough water to last 6 years. And right now there's enough water in storage to last 4.5 years. So there are some water agencies like Valley Water down in Santa Clara County, which are really nervous, and they have reason to be. But San Francisco is better off probably than any other water agency in the state. And that's why when you hear about, the governor issuing drought response mandates, San Francisco is not included because they have this amazing amount of storage. And a really interesting thing is that in an average water year, San Francisco is entitled to about 3 times as much water as it needs. So what happens is you can have some dry years, they get through it with their storage, and then you have an average year and the storage rebounds really quickly. So here is this graph again, and you can see that during the drought, 2012, 13, 14, 15 were low water years, and San Francisco wasn't able to add water to the reservoirs. They were actually kind of taking water out of their bank account, if you want to look at it that way. 2016 was an average water year, and 2017 was a really big water year. And so what we saw was, because of the water bank, they can keep Hetch Hetchy pretty full most of the time, and there are other reservoirs, but the water bank on paper drops. But then as we were heading into 2016, you see it increasing. And by the summer of 2016, when the state was still technically in drought, the Tuolumne storage was at 85%. And San Francisco had enough water to last 5 years. So this is 4 really dry years, 1 average year, and they had 5 years worth of water in storage. And then 2017, they were entitled to enough water to last 12 years, but they didn't have any place to put it because their reservoirs were pretty full. So they had to dump almost all of that entitlement. So it flowed down the river. The river was maxed out without flooding communities downstream from early January into the summer. It was great for the river. But what happened was they had starved the river for 5 years and then had this one exceptionally good year. So we crunch a lot of numbers. We created a water supply calculator to check out the information that San Francisco puts out. For example, you'll hear them say, oh, if the Bay Delta plan is implemented, we could face 50% rationing. And so what we looked at is like, okay, under current demand, what would happen if the drought of record, 6 years, 87 to 92, repeated, and the Bay Delta plan was in place? And we found they could manage that drought, 6-year drought, without any rationing and without developing any alternative water supplies like recycled water. But then SFPUC says, well, we're planning for our design drought. So the design drought is something that they manufactured, and basically they just took two droughts and put them together. So 87 and 92 followed by the driest 2-year period on record, 76, 77, to create this 8+ year drought. And they're assuming that demand is 265 million gallons per day because that's the sales cap. And they're assuming they're not going to develop any recycled water. So they don't never explain how they come up with 50% rationing. But when people learn, it's like, well, this is ridiculous. And they are going to reconsider some of these issues in a few months. So we would love to call on you to weigh in. I know I can count on Eileen. She's been great. So their drought planning scenario is much more severe than any other in the Bay Area. But even using their scenario, we looked at, okay, what if we had, the max amount of rationing that they want to impose, so 20%, could be higher. I mean, if we really got tight, we know we can use a lot less water, but people want to be comfortable, so 20% rationing. And we make it through 7 years of the design drought, which if you look at the tree ring data, which we did for the last 1100 years, there was never a 7-year sequence that was as severe as this. And then to get through year 8, you would need to develop about 20 million gallons per day of alternative water. And they've identified 35. They talk about it, they haven't developed it. In fact, the Board of Supervisors approved a resolution requiring new commercial buildings on the east side of San Francisco to be dual plumbed so that they can accept recycled water for flushing toilets and for irrigating. And 30 years later, there's no water. So the developers are wondering, it's like, why did we invest in this if you didn't follow through on delivering the water? So I mentioned the survey we did a couple of years ago, professionally done, and we found tremendous support for protecting the Bay, protecting the Tuolumne River. Affordable housing was also something people supported. Market rate, not so much. And then creating office space was the least exciting thing for people, because as you add jobs, the housing crisis gets worse, you're adding traffic. I think a lot of people feel that San Francisco's pretty maxed out as it is right now. And then we found that protecting the environment was a real major motivator for people to conserve water. So 94% said it played at least some role, but 71% said major role. So people were conserving water, trying to protect the fish and the environment, but none of that water benefited the environment because they just held it behind dams. They're waiting for this 8.5-year drought. And so what happened was, for 5 years, the unimpaired flow was just 12%. And then in 2017, it was 79%. So all that water we conserved was dumped into the river in 2017, and it didn't benefit the river when it needed it before. So a recent trick that the SFPUC tried to play was this July, the water agencies were required to submit their updated urban water management plans. And these are plans that basically say, here's what our water supply is, here's demand, here are our conservation programs. This is what we're projecting to happen with population and demand, and will we have enough water? So those get updated every 5 years. And at the beginning of the process, San Francisco was going to use the sales cap of 265 that you see here as current demand and as demand going out to 2045. And it wasn't clear they were doing this. You really got to crunch numbers, which we did. And we said, wait a minute, you're using 265 as demand and you can't do that. And we caught them trying to cook the books, and they were forced to change it. So then they started using their actual demand projections. So we're at 198 million gallons per day currently instead of 265. And then they go up to 236 by 2045. But even these numbers are inflated. They've always been off. In the last 20 years, their urban water management plans were off by an average of more than 20%. So it's very interesting that the financial division at the SFPU says, based on what we've been seeing and what we're expecting, we think water sales are going to remain flat for the next 10 years. And they have an incentive to get it right, because if they're saying, oh, we're going to be selling lots of water, they could end up in a deficit. So San Francisco has two sets of books. The water supply people say we're going to have huge demand, and finance says demand's going to probably remain flat. So here's where the urban water management plan is going to be way off. The population projections are based on information from Plan Bay Area. You might have heard of that. So this is ABAG and MTC, and they're projecting that they're trying to address the jobs, housing imbalance, but basically they're saying, okay, well, we're going to add 1 million jobs in the next by 2050, and so we're going to need to add a lot more housing to house the people who need it now, as well as these 1 million more jobs. And so we're expecting the population of the Bay Area to grow by 2.5 million by 2050. And here's where they're projecting the development will go. So, 16% of the housing in San Francisco, 17% of the jobs in San Francisco. So, that's a lot more people. And in our survey, we explained to people what Plan Bay Area was. It's just this many people, this many jobs. And we said, do you think this will improve your quality of life or worsen it? And of the people who had an opinion, 85% thought it would make their quality of life worse. So when you have 85 people opposed to this much growth, it's really going to be hard to get it through. And I think the commissioners at the SFPUC got this. We had a workshop in July, and they asked a lot of questions about population, and they asked staff to come back with some answers, which they might or might not. They tend to not like to address things that make them uncomfortable. But in their urban water management plan, they pointed out that over the last 15 years, San Francisco's population grew by 118,000 people, and they're projecting in the next 15 years, it's going to grow twice as fast. So you can imagine twice as many people in the next 15 years as in the last 15 years, highly unlikely. And the standard for population projections is the California Department of Finance, and their projections for 2045 are 4 times less than what San Francisco is projecting in their urban water management plan. And if their projections are, the Department of Finance are accurate, and they're much more likely to be accurate than San Francisco's, that would reduce demand by 10 million gallons per day. So that's a lot of water. It's more than 10% of what demand is in San Francisco, probably closer to 15%. So there's still a lot we can do with conservation. San Francisco does pretty well. Per capita water use is one of the lowest in the state. The BOSCA member agencies, they have work to do. They have more landscape irrigation, so that has a big impact. But there's a lot of innovative things happening, and a lot of those are becoming standards now, and codes are changing. So we need to keep up with that. Every time there's a drought, there's a big push to use water more efficiently. So we're seeing that now. Landscaping is the big low-hanging fruit. If you have a lawn of grasses that evolved in a wet climate like Europe or the East Coast, you got to irrigate it during the summer. But native plants and other drought-tolerant plants can make for beautiful landscaping. The native plants encourage wildlife, pollinators, and others, so you get the added benefit and use a lot less water. Gray water, the people can use their wastewater from the laundry or from the shower to water their trees and plants. And so you're giving that water a second use. And then at the larger scale, can do recycled water and use that water for irrigating areas outside. San Francisco has very little recycled water right now. It's 0.1 million gallons per day. And that's pretty embarrassing. They're way behind Southern California. So we tease them about that, in the competition with Southern California, they're way ahead. And then you got advanced purified water, so you can actually create drinking water from wastewater. That doesn't appeal to some people. They have the yuck factor, but it's basically astronaut water. And this is down in San Jose. And the water coming out of this is actually higher quality than the Delta water that they depend on. When you have Hetch Hetchy water, it's kind of hard to do better than that. But for some communities, it certainly is a step up. And then you don't need the second set of pipes. You can just put this directly into the pipes and use it for everything, whether it's drinking or cooking or irrigation. And where there's a lot of potentials with irrigate in the agricultural sector. So we pay $2,000 per acre foot. The farmers in Stanislaus County pay $20 an acre foot. We pay 100 times more. So there's a real incentive for us to conserve and use water efficiently. For them, it's like, why would they invest in something like drip irrigation when it's going to cost them a lot more than just doing flood irrigation? So what I think is going to happen, which makes a lot of sense, is if the Bay Delta plan is implemented and San Francisco is really nervous about running out of water, they can approach the irrigation districts and say, look, we will pay for infrastructure upgrades and we'd like to share in the savings, kind of like the water bank. You know, we get credit for half the water that's saved. And this would cost them about $400 an acre foot versus paying $3,000 or $4,000 an acre foot to develop alternative water supplies in the Bay Area. So it would be a win-win. If the irrigation districts, they would, get the infrastructure, they'd be using a lot less water, and San Francisco would get the water as well. And then another idea is to pay for the infrastructure to capture water in wet years like 2017 and stick it in the ground to recharge the groundwater basin. And that can be used for agriculture in dry years like this year, and San Francisco would get credits for it. And by the way, San Francisco, if San Francisco were to pay the irrigation districts the full value of an acre foot of water, so the value to the farmer, to laborers, to processors and distributors, it costs about $1,000 an acre foot, which is a small price to pay for San Francisco. So in theory, the farmer and all those other people tied into the ag economy could make the same amount of money that they are currently without doing any work. And then San Francisco has water available for Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and other places. So there are a lot of solutions if we work together. Thank you so much for considering these issues. I know that you have some questions. Anyone who would like to be on our email list, you can sign up online, tuolumne.org/signup. And my email is peter@tuolumne.org. So if there's anything we don't get to and you want to follow up, please email me and I will do my best to respond.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is a great presentation. People can also put their names and questions in the chat room. But we do now have time for a few questions, Q&A, but we have some pre-submitted questions, which Eileen Boken has available. And so we will start with Eileen.
Peter, hi. I did submit a link to this. So it's called the UC Solar Aqua Grid. And the question is, if the concept is to cover irrigation canals with solar panels, and the idea is that by covering the irrigation canals with solar panels, that this would do three things. It would reduce evaporation, which is a really big issue. It would generate solar power, and it would reduce the use of diesel pumps, which are now the ways that a lot of the water is conveyed. And so the question is, how could the PUC, the SFPUC, get the Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts to really be persuaded to deploy this?
Well, that's a good question. And one thing about San Francisco, the Hetch Hetchy water is it's in pipes all the way to the Bay Area. because it's got to be pressurized to get to Fisherman's Wharf. So you're absolutely right. It's the irrigation districts and their canals that have the potential for that. And, one thing is San Francisco could say, hey, how about we cover your irrigation ditches with solar panels? We get the electricity, you save water. That might appeal to them. I think, that's a good thing to bring up in a master deal between the agencies. They don't always get along. The irrigation districts are kind of threatened by San Francisco. It's kind of like San Francisco is a big, their big brother. They worry that San Francisco has more political clout. They have these senior water rights, and they really use them to get as much as they can from San Francisco. So San Francisco ends up paying them a lot of money for, getting a little bit of water here and there. And I think, but I think what's going to happen is they probably aren't going to do anything right now. But if the Bay Delta plan is implemented, all of a sudden reality is going to set in, that we have a different playing field. And then I think the irrigation districts are going to come to San Francisco and say, hey, let's play ball. And, I mentioned earlier that climate change will likely benefit San Francisco's water rights. The Turlock Irrigation District, they cited a study in their agricultural water management plan that basically said, we're seeing and expecting the amount of water coming down the river to be about the same as it has been, but it's going to shift. And so, in the past, 60% of the runoff came in that time period, mid-April to mid-June. And by 2100, it's likely to be 30 to 40%. So a lot of water is going to move out of the time when they have a bigger share into when they have less. So San Francisco's got a big bargaining chip. So, we keep pushing for everyone to talk and work out some solutions. It's a slow process.
All right. Eileen, did you have another question pre-submitted?
No, that's the only one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that some people have already found the little raise hand button. So let's go to people that have done that, beginning with Ruben. You have a question.
Yes, thanks. So Peter, you've mentioned, and sometimes in your emails, you talk about making comments at the SFPUC meetings and different things like that. I'd be happy to do that, but I've never been quite clear what to say so I don't sound like an idiot. And so I've kind of stayed mute. Do you have any suggestions for how to sort of come up with proper verbiage to point out at various meetings?
Sure. So there are a couple different ways to comment. At the beginning of the meeting, near the beginning, is public comment on things that are not agendized but are under the purview of the SFPUC. And you can have up to 2 minutes. And the meetings are online right now. You can watch it on video, or you can listen on the phone. If you want to comment, you got to be on the phone, and then they explain what you need to do. You hit *3, and they'll tell you you've been unmuted when it's your time to talk. Just a new voice saying, hey, I really care about the environment, the Tuolumne River. I'm hearing, that SFPUC is not a good steward of the river. I read an article. It doesn't have to be something really specific, but it's like, hey, here's another person who really cares and knows that there are problems. That helps.
You don't have to sound like you're a scientist and coming in with data or anything like that.
No. Now, on our website, if you go to our work and then you scroll down to advocacy and revive the Tuolumne, it's a few steps. Maybe I'll just send you the direct link. There's a page called Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and there's just quick bullet facts there. So, just pulling out a fact or two that resonates with you and saying that makes you look like more of an expert. There is going to be a water supply workshop on September 17th, probably from 2 to 5. So they're doing these workshops now, which have been really good, and they hear from, all different sides, and they're really trying to educate themselves better. Before it was just, whatever staff said held. But now, we have a chance to point out reality, and we are making some progress. So for that, I'll send out an email and say, here are some specific things you can mention. But even just saying, it's like, Hetch Hetchy water is too precious to use only once, use it and then release it into the bay. It doesn't make sense. We got to recycle more water. And, some other points you could make are that, there are a lot of buildings that are piped for recycled water, been waiting for 30 years. They haven't gotten it yet. So there are enough people who call in with really specific comments that might be more technical, but just having, a new name saying, hey, I'm aware of this. I heard an ad on KCBS radio. Our friends at Golden State Salmon Association have been running some really good ads. That all helps.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ruben.
Thank you, Ruben. Great question. And again, when you ask a question, please be sure that you lower your hand so that we don't go on to think that you're still having a question. Also, remember, please, to ask only one question, keep your question short, and request information, as Ruben just did, from the speaker. We don't want a lot of, this is my opinion, don't you agree with me, this sort of thing. Keep your question short, simple. Thank you. Okay, Tomasita, you have a question.
Hello.
You might be on mute. Oh.
Hello, thank you.
Tomasita?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm very, very, very concerned about the salmon, and I didn't get the exact picture. It sounds like it's a really, really critical situation, not only on the Tuolumne River, but of course on the McCloud River and all around California. And so what is the chance of getting them to increase the flow to the rivers in California immediately? Like, how can we bring that about? Because it sounds like the salmon all over California are really on the brink of extinction.
Yeah, a lot of tribes are involved in these issues because culturally, salmon are so important to their livelihoods. And so we're working with a lot of tribes, a lot around the Klamath and Trinity and the McCloud. And it's, the State Water Board is in this position where there's just not enough water to go around. I mean, California, the water rights equal 5 times as much water as we get on average. So there are senior right holders who almost always get their water, and there are some junior right holders that sometimes get it, some pretty rarely. But what's happening on the upper Sacramento River, where we still have winter run Chinook salmon, which are an endangered species, is the water they're releasing from Lake Shasta, the Shasta Reservoir, is too warm. And a few years ago, there was, I think it was like an 80% die-off of the babies. And this year it could be close to 100%. So I think what we have to do is we have to really rethink water rights in California. And we need to think about carrying capacity. It's like, how much water can we divert without destroying the ecosystem that we also depend on? And so I think, the approach of the State Water Board is the right approach, is like, okay, change the playing field, percentage of unimpaired flow, then we need to figure out how to work within that. And that will drive innovation. But what's always happened is it's like, oh, we need more water, we'll just take it from the rivers. And under Trump, there was a biological opinion. So this is required to say, if we do this, how's it going to affect endangered species? That there was a draft report that the Los Angeles Times got a hold of, and the scientists said taking more water from the Delta will harm threatened and endangered species. Well, Trump sidelined those scientists. They brought in a new group that said, yeah, we can take, another 500,000 acre feet and it won't affect these threatened and endangered species. And the water agencies glommed onto that, including the San Francisco PUC. And the proposal they've put instead of the Bay Delta plan, it's called a voluntary agreement, basically depends on this Trump era rule that is likely to be changed. So I think the key is we got to be involved, we got to change policy, and we got to encourage more cooperation between urban areas and ag areas. And maybe we need to revisit exporting crops to other places. Is it our duty to feed the world? 20%, 26% of the crops grown in California are exported overseas. So we're taking a public trust resource, which is water, belongs to the people of California. Some people have water rights to put it to beneficial use. And you can argue that growing cheaper food to feed Californians benefits all Californians. But when you're exporting it, it benefits a lot of times, big ag at the expense of the rest of California. So they're privatizing the gains and socializing the losses. And that is a huge amount of water. So to me, if enough people realized what's going on, they would say, this is crazy. If we did some kind of citizen initiative, it would pass overwhelmingly. But the legislature, they're just not, engaged in these issues. And they fear big ag. I mean, agriculture produces 2% of the state's economy, but if you ask the average person, they'd say, oh, it must be 25% because they're so powerful. But it's just not as important. I mean, it's important to eat. And, I'm grateful that we have good agriculture in California, but we need to use the water more wisely.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Mary Eliza, you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I actually had one clarifying question and one technical question, if that's okay. The clarifying question is, by the Delta plan, are you referring to the plan to tunnel water out of the Delta? Is that what the Delta plan is that you're referring to?
Really good question. So you're talking about the tunnel, which is kind of like the peripheral canal before, but it's a tunnel instead of a canal. And that used to be called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So it was really confusing because this is the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. So most environmental groups see the tunnel as a threat, that it would allow greater diversions from the Sacramento River. And so most environmental groups would say that's bad. The Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan is very good because it focuses on leaving water in rivers and flowing out into the Delta and the Bay.
Okay, so if it's okay, I have one other quick question, and that is, in terms of the dams on the rivers, I've been looking at some of the smaller rivers and some of the dams. It looks as if they've got them several in a succession on some of the rivers. I'm wondering, is it at all possible to have a half dam, so you're not really covering the entire river with the dam, so fish can get past wherever that dam is, and there could still be some capture of some power and some, whatever they're going to do with that dam, but you are allowing, the water to flow partially through the dam. Is that at all possible?
Well, what's more realistic is fish ladders. So these are, they're not like human ladders, but they have these pools that gradually get higher, and the fish can kind of jump up and get over the dam. Really big dams, you can't really do that. For those, right, they do something called trap and haul, where the fish are coming up to spawn, they'll trap them and they'll put them in a truck, they'll take them up above the dam. So I think, but fish ladders in some places have been very effective. And if you're ever in Seattle, they have some locks there, and they have a fish ladder, and you can actually go down and see the fish, the salmon, swimming past. They've got glass, and you see them get over the dam that way. So that is one way to deal with the dam.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Mary Eliza, we have Jean wanting to ask a question. Do we have enough time?
Yes, we don't have any time limit.
Okay. Okay, Jean, over to you. What's your question?
Thank you, Peter. This was really fascinating and way over my head, but I wonder if you could answer a general question. What would you say are the 1 or 2 or 3 biggest issues or problems that California is going to be facing regarding these water issues? And how optimistic are you that they're going to be solved in the reasonable future?
Good question. I would say that, so the projections are that precipitation, the amount isn't going to change dramatically, but the timing is. And so we're going to have years where there are bigger water years, and we're going to have, drier years. And so there's going to be a lot of talk about how do you capture that water during the big water years. And some people would say we need to build more dams. Environmentalists say we need to replenish groundwater that is depleted and is causing a lot of problems. So water agencies, they kind of have these conflicting challenges that they have to protect against flooding downstream. So they want to have some capacity in their reservoirs to capture a lot of runoff if it comes all at once. But at the same time, they want to have enough water to get through an extended dry period. And the technology is actually getting better to project or predict where storms are going to land. And, at some points they like, oh my God, there's a storm coming. We got to release water so we have capacity to prevent flooding. And then the storm avoids them. And then we have a dry stretch. And it's like, gosh, we could really use that water now. So that's a challenge. The San Francisco is in good shape with water. They have a lot of storage, but with higher temperatures, vegetation is going to struggle, and there's going to be more wildfires, which we're seeing. The rim fire in 2013, which at the time was the largest ever in the Sierra that we know about, was 97% in the Tuolumne drainage. And that, you had sediment coming into the river after that, fortunately downstream of Hetch Hetchy. But also, when you have less vegetation take up water, you have more runoff into the reservoir. And some water agencies actually, clear forests so that they'll get a higher yield from the watershed. So what's expected with climate change is we're going to see, earlier runoff. We're going to see bigger swings in the years. We're going to see the remaining glaciers disappear. And the two in Yosemite that feed the Tuolumne are actually not considered glaciers anymore because they've shrunk so much that they don't have the mass to move downhill. And we're going to see higher temperatures, so drier vegetation, probably more bark beetles infesting the forest there, killing trees, higher fire load. So, I don't want to be gloom and doom, but we have challenging times ahead. We got to, shift to a carbon-free economy as soon as possible. But the optimistic thing is that we're extremely unlikely to run out of water. So
Right.
We're fortunate that we have a system like we do.
Thank you for saying that, Peter. I just wanted to thank you again for also mentioning the rim fire. I was on the civil grand jury that year. And one thing the civil grand jury does every year is it goes to Hetch Hetchy to make sure that the water supply is intact. Well, that was the year of the rim fire. We couldn't get to Hetch Hetchy that year. So I had to re-up for another year. And that's when I finally got to see the water supply.
Did you get to stay at the chalet?
Yes.
Oh, very nice.
We
Very
did
nice.
finally. So that was wonderful.
Thank you for serving.
Yes. Mary Eliza, you said that there was somebody who had a question in the chat room. Basically, I think the question in the chat room was about, are people concerned with theft of water, for example, hoses and that sort of thing? Is that a real viable concern? People stealing water?
Probably not at the household level, but there is a concern about water diverters taking water from the river that doesn't belong to them. And it's really hard to monitor that. Probably everyone here has seen Chinatown, and basically stealing water that doesn't belong to you in the dead of night. And so there are water rights, but not everyone adheres to them. And sometimes, even at the water district level, there will be a farmer who kind of opens up the canal and in the middle of the night and takes a bunch of water and doesn't pay for it. So we probably are going to need to see better monitoring of where water goes.
Okay, thank you. We have somebody that has to leave and is asking if the meeting is being recorded. Yes, the meeting is being recorded. So please let Mary Eliza know, and we will see what we can do to get the meeting to you. Ruben has another question. Ruben?
Okay, yeah, thanks. So Peter, you were talking about annual crops versus these nut trees and things like that. You drive down I-5, you used to see it down by Lost Hills in the southern San Joaquin Valley. It's just growing like a cancer further and further north. Is there anything that someone like me or that wants to get involved should do without, it being a full-time job other than, sending donations to you folks and stuff?
Well, weighing in with the governor and, state legislators would be helpful. I mean, if they were hearing from a lot of people about, hey, I'm alarmed that, we're in this, second drought within, in the last decade, and I'm seeing all of these orchards go in that can't be fallowed. A lot of times we've thought of agriculture as kind of a special reservoir that in dry years, you fallow crops, alfalfa, things like that, and that frees up the water. So it's almost like having, a reservoir, and that's going away. And they're pumping a lot of groundwater to keep these orchards going. And the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is saying you got to correct this. Unfortunately, it's kind of a long time frame before they actually have to implement. But the water agencies are thinking about it more. So I think just any opportunity, if someone's your state legislator is having sidewalk hours or invites people to weigh in to bring up this issue. Just the more people bringing it up over and over again really helps out. And ultimately the legislature is very slow moving. They just water is not their thing. So if you have a lot of money, Ruben, and you want to fund a citizen initiative, take it directly to the voters. I think that's how we could really get things moving fast.
Ruben,
Okay.
does that answer your
But
question?
at the low level, just sending letters to the governor and these opening forms, just commenting that you're saying is helpful.
Yeah. And maybe, encouraging friends, like if you receive an email that resonates with you, forwarding it to friends, trying to get more people involved, really turning it into kind of a meme that more people are paying attention to it.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thanks.
Right. Ruben, that's what we do at CSFN all the time. We're constantly writing letters to legislators. Okay, Tomasita, you have a question. Tomasita?
You're muted, Tomasita.
You're muted.
Sorry. I'm concerned about fracking. Could you talk about fracking? Because I think that I've heard the governor or maybe the newspapers talk about conserving water, but then it never seems that the frackers, all those big oil companies, taking our clean water and then injecting the poisoned water after they frack back into the soil. And I'm wondering, what is the chance to get the governor to issue an executive order to ban fracking? And what's the status of fracking? How can it be allowed to continue?
Yeah, I agree. Fracking is a really bad thing. Fortunately, we don't have fracking in the Tuolumne watershed. And I'm not an expert on fracking, but it uses a tremendous amount of water. The water can get contaminated, end up in the groundwater. It's producing sequestered fossil fuel, and then we burn it, and it's a cheap natural gas. So people saw that as a good thing and helped America become more energy independent. But it's like we got to move off of fossil fuels, and we got to do it really quickly. So I believe that Newsom imposed a moratorium on new fracking permits. And I don't think he went as far as to create a deadline when fracking would not be allowed, but he took a step in the right direction. So there are some really good groups working on fracking in California. You might just do a little Google search and find, probably some websites have some good information on it.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Mary Eliza, I'm not seeing any more raised hands.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. We will post it. We'll hopefully put together a place on YouTube to be posting these. And anybody who wants any information about it, just keep in touch with the CSFN website. Once we change from one meeting to the next, there's another page right next to the town hall page called events, and the links to the former events and town halls are listed on that page. So you should be able to go there and see links to the recording. Any more questions?
Just a comment from Jean saying it was terrific. Thank you, Peter.
And Jean, are you glad that there's no test at the end?
Oh, you bet.
It's a
I
lot
think
of
we're saying-
information, but as long as
you know,
people,
sorry, go ahead.
walk away knowing our water comes from the Tuolumne, there's a lot of potential for San Francisco to be better stewards. We're not going to run out of water, but we might run out of salmon unless we act quickly. Then I feel satisfied. So thank you very much, Jean.
Yeah, well, I'm curious to dig into this a little bit more because it's not something I know about, but I like this kind of data. So thank you for putting this all together for us.
Yeah, if you send me an email, peter@tuolumne.org, I can direct you to some really concise information.
Okay, great.
Okay, we might ask some questions about corruption as well. If you have any knowledge about that, we're sort of taking a list of corruptible issues. So thank you.
Thank you,
I
Peter.
guess-
This has been very uplifting.
Yeah. I guess we can close the meeting at this point and quit recording. So if anybody has anything else, it won't be on the record. If I can figure out how to stop recording.
I'd like to
Well,
talk
we're still hanging out here. Peter, just quickly, you were talking about the species that are going extinct. You had listed Delta Smelt there. The year before COVID, I thought, and that's the last I'd seen, I thought the survey didn't find any fish. Are they still there or are they completely extinct? Do you have any idea?
You're right about the survey not finding them. They could be extinct. They certainly are on the verge of extinction, at least. Could be there are some, little pockets hanging on here and there, but we'll have a better sense, with the next survey in the coming years. And if we have, number of years where none are turning up, then they probably will be declared extinct.
Okay, so there's no new survey that showed they'd sprung back to life or anything?
No.
Okay, thanks.
So let me say this, it was 99% percentage of the Delta Smelt. That's very close to being extinct, but it's not confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks.
Thank you. See you guys later.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Maria Eliza.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you. Nice
Follow
job.
me.
Thank you so much.
Follow you.
Thank you.
Thank you.